My phone buzzed with a message I never expected to hear from my own flesh and blood. It was my daughter, Amanda. Her voice dripped with arrogant triumph as she spat the words out. "We are leaving the country tomorrow, Dad. Oh, and by the way, your beach villa has already been sold. Thanks for the retirement fund. Bye." I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply took a sip of my coffee, let out a deep, genuine laugh, and replied, "You are welcome, sweetheart. But you forgot one tiny detail about that property." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her smugness faltering for a split second. I hung up the phone. She had no idea the nightmare she had just unleashed upon herself. Before I tell you exactly what kind of hell my daughter walked blindly into, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that ungrateful children need to learn that actions have severe consequences. I am Vincent. I am 62 years old, and for the last 30 years I worked as a structural engineer building a life of quiet comfort in a modest Seattle suburb. I was a man who planned everything down to the millimeter, but I never planned for my only child to view me as nothing more than a disposable bank account. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. The autumn rain was tapping gently against the bay windows of my study. I had been enjoying a quiet moment, looking over some old blueprints, when the silence was shattered by the shrill ring of my cell phone. Amanda rarely called unless she needed something paid for. Trevor, her husband of 3 years, was allegedly running a tech startup that was perpetually on the verge of a breakthrough. That breakthrough always seemed to require another $10,000 from my savings. I answered with a simple greeting, but she did not even offer a hello. Her words came fast, breathless, laced with a toxic exhilaration. She told me they had packed their bags. She boasted that the closing documents on the coastal villa had been finalized that very morning, the money was clearing, and they were catching a red-eye flight to Europe. She actually giggled when she told me I should have kept a closer eye on my assets. For a fraction of a second, the sheer audacity of her betrayal hung in the air. A father is supposed to feel a crushing heartbreak when his child steals from him. Instead, a cold, absolute clarity washed over me. I realized that the daughter I raised was dead, replaced by a greedy stranger. That was when I laughed. A deep, resonant sound that clearly unsettled her. I delivered my final cryptic warning, tapped the red button to end the call, and tossed the phone onto my desk. Let her sweat over those words on her flight. I had work to do. I did not panic. Panic is for people who are caught off guard. I walked out of the study and headed down the hallway toward my reinforced home office. The hardwood floors creaked slightly under my steps, a familiar sound, in a house that suddenly felt like a battleground. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, engaging the deadbolt. My office was not just a place for reading. It was the nerve center of my private life. 3 days ago, my gut instinct had warned me that Trevor's financial demands were becoming suspiciously frantic. I had quietly upgraded the security protocols on all my properties and accounts. I sat down in my leather chair, the leather cool against my skin, and woke up my encrypted desktop terminal. My fingers danced across the keyboard, bypassing the standard login screens and diving straight into the hidden surveillance network I had installed around their rental property last month. I brought up the high-definition feed from the camera concealed in the street lamp directly across from their driveway. The monitor flickered to life. The scene playing out in front of me was pure chaos. This was not the departure of a successful tech couple embarking on a European vacation. This was a frantic escape. A rented black SUV sat idling in their driveway with the trunk popped open. Trevor burst out of the front door, his face pale, his movements erratic. He was literally throwing designer suitcases into the back of the vehicle, not caring that they crashed against the bumper. Amanda followed right behind him, clutching a heavy tote bag to her chest, constantly looking over her shoulder at the street. They were practically tripping over their own feet. They looked like hunted animals. They were not just leaving the country. They were running for their lives. I watched them peel out of the driveway, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. I minimized the camera feed and opened a secure browser window. It was time to see exactly how deep their desperation ran. I navigated to my primary banking portal, a high-yield account, where I kept a significant portion of my liquid assets. Yesterday, acting on that same gut feeling, I had implemented a strict two-factor authentication protocol, requiring biometric approval for any transaction over $1,000. The moment the bank interface loaded, the screen flashed with a critical security alert. The text was stark red against the white background. Unauthorized withdrawal attempt flagged and blocked. I clicked on the detailed report. Exactly 45 minutes before Amanda called me to gloat, someone had tried to drain $50,000 directly from my checking account. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the digital footprint left behind by the failed transaction. The routing numbers did not match Trevor's supposed Silicon Valley business accounts. I ran a trace on the destination IP address through a forensic software program an old colleague had given me. The progress bar crawled across the screen, decoding the masked servers. When the true destination finally populated on the display, a grim smile spread across my face. The money was not going to a startup. It was being routed to a notorious offshore gambling syndicate located in the Cayman Islands, a syndicate known for catering to high-stakes losers and employing very dangerous men to collect their debts. Trevor was not a tech genius. He was a degenerate gambler drowning in illicit debt. The 50 grand was likely a desperate attempt to buy them enough time to flee before the collectors broke their legs. And Amanda, blinded by her own greed, had tied her fate to a sinking ship. She thought she had outsmarted me by forging the sale of the beach property to fund their escape. But as I sat in the glow of my monitors looking at the blocked transaction and the offshore routing codes, I knew her nightmare was only just beginning. Because the property she had so arrogantly sold from under me was about to become the anchor that dragged them both straight to the bottom of the ocean. I grabbed my keys and walked out into the damp Seattle morning. I did not waste time calling lawyers or screaming into the void. Action is the only cure for betrayal. I drove my truck straight downtown to the county clerk records division. The building was a massive concrete structure of endless bureaucracy filled with people waiting in long lines. I did not wait. I walked directly to the priority desk reserved for commercial contractors and property developers. I knew the head clerk there, a tired man named Gregory. I bypassed the usual pleasantries completely. I told Gregory I needed physical copies of any and all recent deed transfers filed under my name for my coastal properties. Gregory typed on his keyboard, and his brow furrowed as a recent entry popped up on his screen. Gregory printed the file and slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the counter. He mentioned that the transaction had just been finalized and filed electronically the previous afternoon. I picked up the document. The cover page declared a complete transfer of ownership. I flipped straight to the signature line on the final page. I stared at the dark ink. The forgery was nothing short of a masterpiece. The loops and angles matched my handwriting perfectly. Amanda had spent her entire life watching me sign checks and authorize structural blueprints. She had practiced this carefully. But a signature alone cannot transfer real estate in this state. It requires a witness. It requires a certified legal seal. I moved my eyes down to the bottom corner of the page. There it was. The official stamp of a licensed public notary. I read the name printed beneath the faded blue seal. Leon Vargas. A cold, sharp realization settled in my chest. Leon was not a random administrative worker operating out of a local bank. Leon was Trevor's supposed business partner. He was the co-founder of the tech startup that never seemed to produce a single piece of actual technology. They had orchestrated this entire theft together. Trevor provided the corrupt notary, and my daughter provided the forged signature. They had executed a coordinated legal heist right under my nose. Gregory looked at me from across the counter and asked if everything was in order. The instinct of any normal person would be to shout, to declare fraud, and to demand the police be called immediately. I did none of those things. Disputing the deed right then and there would automatically freeze the transaction, but it would also generate a formal legal notice. That notice would be mailed directly to Amanda and Trevor. It would alert them that I knew about their crime. It would give them crucial time to change their escape route or move the stolen offshore funds into untraceable crypto accounts. I looked Gregory right in the eye, offered a tight smile, and told him everything was perfectly fine. I thanked him for his time, folded the fraudulent documents, and walked out of the building. I needed a professional. I needed someone who operated entirely in the shadows. I sat in my truck and dialed a number I had not used in over 5 years. The man who answered simply grunted into the receiver. His name was Rex. Rex was a former forensic accountant for a federal task force who had grown tired of bureaucratic red tape and moved into the private sector. He was ruthless, brilliant, and operated strictly off the grid. I told him I needed an immediate meeting. He gave me an address for a bleak industrial park on the edge of the city. I put the truck in gear and drove there without hesitation. Rex was waiting inside a hollowed-out warehouse sitting behind a folding table covered in glowing monitors. He did not ask how I was doing or offer hollow sympathies. He simply extended a hand. I gave him the forged deed transfer. I told him my daughter and her husband had stolen my coastal property, forged my signature, and were currently fleeing the country. I told him I did not want the police involved just yet. I wanted to know exactly who bought the property and where the money was sitting right now. Rex adjusted his glasses, scanned the document into his secure terminal, and went to work. For 2 hours, the only sound in the warehouse was the frantic clacking of Rex typing on his mechanical keyboard. He was peeling back the digital layers of the transaction. He bypassed the local registry, dug deep into the state tax records, and began tracing the routing numbers associated with the buyer. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and turned his primary monitor toward me. He asked if I knew who my daughter had sold the villa to. I told him I assumed it was a wealthy family or a corporate developer looking for a vacation home. Rex let out a harsh, rasping laugh. He pointed to a complex web of corporate registrations flashing on his screen. Amanda did not sell the villa to a family. She was in a blind rush. She needed cash immediately to cover Trevor's gambling debts before they left the country. Selling a luxury property through normal real estate channels takes months of rigorous inspections, appraisals, and negotiations. Amanda bypassed all of that. She sold it to a rapid cash purchasing firm. But Rex had traced the parent company of that firm. It was a massive shell corporation registered in a territory known for absolutely zero financial oversight. The company was a notorious front used exclusively for laundering dirty money for international syndicates. Amanda was so blinded by her desperation to secure the funds and flee that she did not care who she was getting in bed with. She had accepted a heavily discounted cash offer from a criminal enterprise just to get the money wired into her account by Tuesday morning. She thought she had pulled off the perfect crime. She thought she had liquidated my hard-earned retirement asset and left me with nothing while she flew off to Europe to live a life of luxury. But greedy people always make mistakes. Their rush to the finish line makes them incredibly sloppy. Rex zoomed in on the specific parcel identification number listed on the forged deed. He cross-referenced it with the county topological maps and public land records. He looked at me and a dangerous smirk began to form on his face. He asked if I had actually read the fine print on the property description Amanda had submitted to the county clerk. I stepped closer and looked at the highlighted text on the screen. The coordinates, the lot number, the legal description of the coastal land. The puzzle pieces suddenly clicked together in my mind. I started to laugh. It was a dark, quiet sound that echoed off the cold warehouse walls. Amanda had been so fiercely focused on perfectly forging my signature and securing Trevor's corrupt notary that she had failed to do her basic due diligence. She had pulled the wrong file from the filing cabinet in my study. I own 2 plots of land on that coastline. One is the pristine multi-million-dollar beach villa she thought she was selling. The other is a vacant adjacent lot I acquired decades ago for a completely different purpose. Amanda did not sell the beautiful beach villa. The paperwork she forged and submitted to a money laundering syndicate actually transferred the ownership of the vacant lot. And that vacant lot was holding a massive dark secret that was about to turn her glorious escape into a federal nightmare. I left the bleak industrial park behind and steered my truck toward the towering glass and steel structures of the financial district. The rain had intensified, washing the city streets in a cold, gray blur, but my mind remained perfectly clear. Rex had handed me the raw data, the raw coordinates of my daughter's monumental blunder. Now I needed to weaponize it. I needed an architect of legal destruction. I parked in the underground garage of an exclusive high-rise and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. I walked past the mahogany reception desk and stepped into a completely soundproofed conference room. Sitting at the far end of the long glass table was Stephen. Stephen was my personal attorney, a man who wielded corporate law with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. He did not ask how I was doing. He saw the look in my eyes, took the forged deed transfer from my hand, and laid it flat on the glass surface. I told Stephen everything Rex had uncovered, including the routing numbers leading to the money laundering syndicate, and the exact parcel identification number Amanda had submitted to the county clerk. Stephen pulled out his encrypted laptop and logged directly into the secure federal property registry. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the raw filings from the previous 24 hours. As the official documents populated on his screen, a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across his face. He looked up at me and confirmed what we both already knew. Amanda was hunting for a ghost, and she had ended up catching a live grenade. To understand the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe Amanda had just triggered, you have to go back exactly 6 months. During a tense Sunday dinner, Amanda had demanded that I hand over the physical deed to my coastal beach villa. She claimed Trevor needed to leverage the property as collateral for a massive bridge loan to save his failing tech startup. When I refused, she threw a violent tantrum right in my dining room, screaming about how I was hoarding my wealth and stifling her husband's genius. That outburst was the final red flag. I saw the absolute entitlement burning in her eyes. I knew right then that she would eventually try to take what she believed was rightfully hers. The very next morning, I sat in this exact same conference room with Stephen. We systematically stripped the actual multi-million-dollar beach villa out of my personal portfolio. We legally transferred the property into an ironclad, irrevocable blind trust. I did not technically own the beautiful coastal home anymore. My signature carried zero legal weight regarding that property. Amanda could not have sold the beach villa even if she had forged 1,000 documents, because the entity she was trying to steal from simply did not exist. So what exactly did she sell to a criminal syndicate? Decades ago, long before the coastline was developed into luxury properties, a chemical processing plant operated adjacent to my land. The company eventually went bankrupt, leaving behind a heavily contaminated industrial dumping site. The toxic runoff threatened to seep into the local water table and compromise the foundation of my nearby villa. I purchased that specific barren plot of land for absolute pennies, purely to build a containment wall and protect my actual home. But the soil was saturated with heavy metals and chemical waste. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency eventually stepped in and condemned the entire parcel. They assessed the severe ecological damage and attached a devastating $1.8 million federal cleanup lien directly to the property deed. It was a radioactive piece of paper sitting dormant in the very back of my filing cabinet for years. When Amanda broke into my study, in her frantic rush to secure funds for Trevor's gambling debts, she did not bother to read the geographical coordinates or the liability disclosures hidden in the fine print. She simply saw a thick folder marked coastal property, grabbed the deed, and ran. She and Trevor brought in their corrupt notary to falsify the transfer of a worthless, toxic wasteland. But Amanda's greed did not stop at simple forgery. She wanted to maximize her stolen windfall. Stephen turned his laptop monitor toward me, pointing to the financial structuring of the sale. If Amanda had sold the property under her own name, the government would have heavily taxed the sudden influx of $500,000 in cash. To dodge those capital gains taxes, she registered a brand new limited liability company just 48 hours ago. She officially named herself as the sole managing director and the primary financial guarantor of the new corporate entity. She executed the sale under this new company shield, assuming she had brilliantly outsmarted the tax authorities. Stephen explained the fatal legal trap she had just walked into. By executing the sale through her own company, Amanda legally acquired the condemned parcel. The moment the county clerk stamped that forged deed, the federal government officially recognized Amanda's company as the new legal owner of the toxic site. And along with the poisoned dirt, she legally and formally assumed the entire $1.8 million federal liability. She had essentially volunteered to take the massive Environmental Protection Agency debt completely off my hands. She chained herself to a financial anchor that would drag her down for the rest of her life. But the trap was even more immediate than the impending federal debt collection. Amanda and Trevor were currently waiting for their payout. They expected $500,000 in dirty cash from the money laundering syndicate to drop into their accounts so they could board their flight and disappear. Stephen pulled up the federal banking protocols on the monitor. He explained that any financial transaction involving a condemned property bearing a federal lien triggers an automatic and immediate hold by the Internal Revenue Service. The syndicate actually wired the funds. The dirty money successfully left the offshore account and hit the domestic escrow account, facilitating the sale. But before a single cent could be routed into Amanda's waiting pockets, the federal tax algorithms caught the transaction. The system recognized the parcel identification number and instantly flagged the $1.8 million debt attached to it. The federal government immediately froze the entire escrow account. The IRS locked the money in a digital vault to satisfy a fraction of the massive cleanup bill Amanda now legally owed them. I sat back in my chair, letting the absolute perfection of her ruin wash over me. The money was gone. Amanda would never see a single dime of it. The criminal syndicate, who believed they were buying a pristine coastal property to wash their illicit funds, had just lost $500,000 and received a highly monitored toxic dumping ground in return. They would be furious. And the only name listed on the fraudulent contract, the only person legally responsible for scamming a dangerous criminal enterprise out of their money, was my daughter. Stephen closed his laptop. He looked at me with cold, professional respect and asked what my next move was. I checked my watch. The international flight Amanda and Trevor were booked on was scheduled to board in exactly 3 hours. Right now, they were probably sitting in their rental car, furiously refreshing their banking apps, waiting for a deposit that was never going to arrive. Soon, panic would set in. They would realize they needed cash immediately to survive. They would realize their grand escape was falling apart. I knew exactly what Amanda would do next. She would fall back on her oldest habit. She would come back to my house under the guise of saying a tearful goodbye, attempting to manipulate me out of whatever liquid cash I had in my home safe. I told Stephen to prepare the defense strategy for the inevitable legal fallout. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and told him I had to get home. My daughter was coming to visit, and I needed to be ready for her. I pulled into my driveway, just as the Seattle rain began to fall in heavy gray sheets. The house was quiet, but the air inside felt charged with a heavy metallic anticipation. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Amanda and Trevor were currently sitting in their rental car, staring at a frozen bank account. Their criminal buyers had wired the $500,000, but the federal government had intercepted every single cent to cover the environmental lien. Panic is a highly predictable emotion. It strips away logic and leaves only a desperate primal need to survive. Amanda needed liquid cash immediately if she was going to board that international flight. She had no choice but to return to the only well she had ever known. I walked into my study and prepared the stage. Behind a framed architectural blueprint on the far wall sat a heavy steel biometric safe. I opened it and removed my genuine documents, leaving only the bait inside. Earlier that morning, Rex had handed me a thick leather pouch containing $50,000 in banded $100 bills. It looked like a standard emergency stash, but the currency was highly specialized. Rex had acquired the cash from an old federal contact. The bills were officially marked sequential currency previously used in an FBI narcotics sting. More importantly, the paper straps binding the stacks contained woven microscopic tracking threads. I placed the bundles inside the steel vault, locked it, and went to the living room to wait. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later. I opened the heavy wooden door to find Amanda standing on the porch, soaking wet and shivering. Her performance was absolutely flawless. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain. She threw her arms around my neck, sobbing uncontrollably. She told me she was so sorry for the harsh words on the phone earlier. She claimed the stress of Trevor moving his startup overseas had pushed her to the breaking point. She begged for my forgiveness, stating she could not bear to get on a plane to Europe, knowing her father was angry with her. If I had not seen her casually forge my signature to sell my property to a money laundering syndicate, I might have actually believed the tears streaming down her cheeks. I played the role of the stern, but ultimately forgiving father. I guided her inside, handed her a towel, and let her sit by the fireplace. I told her we all make mistakes, and that family always finds a way to heal. My words seemed to comfort her, but I could see her eyes darting nervously around the room, analyzing the layout. She offered to make a fresh pot of coffee as a peace offering, stating she wanted us to share one last quiet moment before she left for the airport. I smiled softly and told her that would be wonderful. She walked into the kitchen, out of my direct line of sight. But my living room features a large decorative mirror positioned perfectly to reflect the kitchen island. I watched her reflection closely. She poured the dark roast into 2 ceramic mugs. Then her hand slipped into her designer coat pocket. She pulled out a small plastic vial, unscrewed the cap, and tapped a fine white powder into my mug. She stirred it rapidly until the liquid absorbed the substance. It was a heavy pharmaceutical sedative designed to knock me unconscious for at least 12 hours. She needed me incapacitated so I could not contact the bank or the police while they boarded their flight and disappeared into the clouds. Amanda returned to the living room carrying the 2 steaming mugs. Her hands were perfectly steady. She handed me the dark blue mug, offering a sweet, trembling smile. I took the cup and lowered my gaze. Along the inner rim of the ceramic, a faint, chalky residue lingered where the powder had not fully dissolved. I looked at my daughter. The child I had raised, the girl I had taught to ride a bicycle, was sitting across from me, eagerly waiting for me to drink poison so she could rob me blind. I raised the mug to my lips. I took a deep breath, tilted the cup, and allowed the hot liquid to spill down the front of my dark sweater instead of swallowing it. I placed the mug back on the coffee table. I waited exactly 3 minutes before initiating the collapse. First, I slurred my words purposefully, confusing the time of her flight. Then I let my eyelids flutter shut. Finally, I let my body go completely limp, sliding sideways off the leather cushion until I was slumped heavily against the armrest. I slowed my breathing to a deep rhythmic crawl. The transformation was instantaneous. The moment my head hit the leather, Amanda dropped her tearful facade completely. She did not gasp. She did not check my pulse. She did not ask if I was all right. I heard the sharp clatter of her coffee mug hitting the wooden table. She stood up abruptly. I felt her boot nudge my ankle, roughly testing my unresponsiveness. When I did not react, she let out a short, frustrated sigh. I kept my eyes open just a fraction of an inch, peering through my eyelashes. Amanda reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a solid steel crowbar. The sight of it sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my veins. She marched directly past me without a second glance, heading straight down the hallway toward my study. She knew exactly where I kept the safe. I lay perfectly still, listening to the destruction of my home. The heavy thud of the framed blueprint hitting the floor echoed down the hall. Then came the violent scraping of metal against metal. She was using the crowbar to pry the digital keypad off the wall safe, attempting to short-circuit the locking mechanism. She grunted with the physical effort, her desperation fueling her strength. A loud mechanical click signaled her success. She had cracked the vault. I heard the frantic rustling of paper as she grabbed the banded stacks of cash. She shoved the money into her bag, leaving the heavy steel door hanging wide open. Her footsteps hurried back down the hallway. She did not even look at my slumped body as she moved toward the front entrance. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, causing the windows to rattle slightly. The lock clicked into place from the outside. I sat up slowly, brushing the spilled coffee off my sweater. My mind was perfectly calm. I walked down the hall to my study and looked at the violated safe. The bait was gone. I sat at my desk and woke up my encrypted terminal. The hidden cameras mounted in the ceiling corners had captured everything in high definition. The footage showed her poisoning my drink, producing a weapon, and burglarizing the vault. It was undeniable felony evidence. I did not feel anger as I watched the footage. Anger is a useless emotion that clouds judgment. I only felt the cold satisfaction of a structural engineer watching a flawed building finally collapse under its own weight. Amanda had engineered her own destruction. She had built a foundation of lies, and now she was about to be crushed by it. The most important screen on my monitor was the tracking software Rex had provided. A bright red digital beacon was currently blinking on a satellite map of the city. The marked federal currency was moving rapidly down the interstate. Amanda thought she had just secured her getaway fund. She thought she had outsmarted a tired old man and bought her ticket to freedom. She did not realize she was carrying a federal tracking device directly to the international terminal. I picked up my phone and called Rex. I told him the package was on the move. He told me he was already positioned at the airport, waiting for them to walk right into the final snare. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. It was time to watch the absolute collapse of their criminal escape. I pulled my truck into the short-term parking structure of the international airport. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets, but inside the concrete garage the air was thick with the smell of exhaust and impending consequence. Rex was already waiting in a nondescript gray surveillance van parked on the top level. I climbed into the passenger seat and shut the heavy door, blocking out the noise of the departing jets overhead. Rex did not offer a greeting. He simply pointed to a cluster of glowing monitors mounted in the back of the van. The red digital beacon was pulsing steadily on a map of the international terminal. My stolen money was currently sitting at check in counter 4. We tapped directly into the airport high-definition security feeds. Rex had friends in federal aviation security who owed him favors. The screen switched to a crisp overhead view of the main concourse. There they were. Amanda and Trevor were standing in the priority boarding lane, shifting their weight nervously. Amanda kept checking her phone while looking over her shoulder. She thought she was looking for me or the local police. She had no idea the net had already been cast much wider. Trevor looked arrogant. He was wearing a tailored suit, attempting to project the image of a successful tech executive traveling abroad. He did not look like a man running from underground loan sharks. He looked like a man who believed he had just gotten away with the perfect crime. They cleared the initial security checkpoint because the cash was concealed in a specialized carry-on bag designed to obscure dense paper stacks from standard imaging scanners. They moved into the international departure concourse. They had 90 minutes until their flight to Geneva boarded. This is where arrogance always destroys the greedy. They could have simply sat at their gate quietly and blended in. But Trevor was a man addicted to status. He could not resist the urge to live the lifestyle he had just stolen. I watched on the monitor as he bypassed the standard seating areas and steered Amanda directly toward the exclusive first-class VIP lounge. They approached the front reception desk. The camera angle was perfect. We could see the polished marble counter and the uniformed attendant greeting them. Trevor leaned against the desk with a smug smile. He was requesting an immediate day pass upgrade for the private suite. The attendant informed him of the exorbitant fee required for non-members. Trevor did not even blink. He unzipped his leather bag and reached inside. My chest tightened slightly. He pulled out one of the banded stacks of $100 bills. the very same marked currency Rex had provided from the federal narcotics sting. Trevor casually tossed the banded stack onto the marble counter like a high roller at a casino table. The attendant maintained her professional smile, but her eyes darted to the paper strap binding the cash. Federal Reserve banks and specialized task forces use very specific serial ink on marked currency. Furthermore, the ultraviolet threading woven into those paper bands is designed to react instantly when passed under the specialized counterfeit scanners used at high-security airport terminals. The attendant picked up the stack and passed it under the blue scanner light mounted flush with her desk. The machine did not just verify the bills. It triggered an automated silent alarm wired directly to the Department of Homeland Security and the Airport Police Division. I watched the attendant calmly excuse herself, stepping into a back office while leaving the money on the counter. Trevor turned to Amanda and laughed, clearly making a joke about the slow service. He had absolutely no idea the silent countdown had just begun. Less than 60 seconds later, the terminal erupted. 6 armed tactical officers in heavy body armor materialized from the surrounding corridors, moving with terrifying speed. They did not shout or draw their weapons immediately, but their formation was designed for absolute containment. They swarmed the VYP reception desk, cutting off every possible avenue of escape. 2 officers grabbed Trevor by the shoulders, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the marble counter. Trevor screamed in shock, protesting that he was a wealthy executive and demanding to know what was happening. Another officer secured Amanda, pulling her arms behind her back. She dropped her designer purse and began sobbing wildly, screaming that there was a massive mistake. A federal agent in a plain suit walked into the frame. He picked up the stack of marked bills, holding it up to Trevor's face. He then seized the leather carry-on bag, dumping the remaining bundles of stolen cash onto the counter. The agent spoke into his radio, confirming the recovery of the flagged currency. Airport security immediately confiscated the money and pulled their passports from Amanda's trembling hands. The federal agent informed them that they were being detained under suspicion of grand larceny and attempting to transport illicit federal funds across international borders. The camera feed showed them being frog-marched through the crowded concourse, humiliated and terrified, while hundreds of travelers watched them in silence. They were dragged into a windowless holding room deep in the bowels of the terminal. Rex tapped a few keys and switched our audio feed to the hidden microphones inside the detention room. We could hear the heavy steel door slam shut, leaving Amanda and Trevor alone for a brief moment before the federal interrogators arrived. Amanda was hyperventilating, pacing the small room and screaming at Trevor. She demanded to know why he had used the cash from the safe instead of a credit card. Trevor yelled back, claiming his cards were dangerously close to their limits and he did not want to leave a digital trail before the flight. But the reality of their detention was sinking in. They were facing immediate felony charges and their flight was leaving without them. Trevor pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. Trevor told Amanda to calm down. He stated he was going to access their offshore accounts and wire a massive sum to a domestic burner account. He planned to use the newly laundered funds from the sale of the beach villa to hire the best criminal defense attorney in the city and post whatever exorbitant bail the judge set. He confidently opened his encrypted banking application, ready to deploy the $500,000 Amanda had secured through her fraudulent real estate deal. I leaned closer to the monitor in the van, listening intently to the audio feed. I waited for the exact moment his digital illusion shattered. A sharp gasp echoed through the speakers. Trevor stared at his phone screen, his face draining of all color. He frantically refreshed the application, tapping the glass screen with desperate force. Amanda stopped pacing and demanded to know what was wrong. Trevor could barely form the words. He told her the account was locked. Not just the offshore account, but every single domestic banking profile tied to their social security numbers. Amanda snatched the phone from his hands. She read the bold red text dominating the screen. The financial institution had suspended all assets under direct orders from the Internal Revenue Service. The trap I had laid in the lawyer office had snapped completely shut. When Amanda legally assumed ownership of that toxic coastal property, she also assumed the massive environmental cleanup lien attached to it. The moment the criminal syndicate had wired the funds for the fake villa, the federal tax algorithms had flagged her newly formed company. The government had instantly frozen their entire financial existence to satisfy the $1.8 million debt she now legally owed them. They were utterly paralyzed. They had no cash. Their passports were seized. Their accounts were frozen by the federal government. They had stolen my money, betrayed my trust, and sold their souls for a grand escape. Now they were sitting in a concrete room with absolutely nothing left. I sat in the dim light of my reinforced study watching the live feed from the county precinct. Rex had tapped directly into the public release logs of the federal holding facility. It took exactly 14 hours for the authorities to process my daughter and her husband. They were released pending a formal federal summons because the full scope of their money laundering conspiracy was still being untangled by government agents. But their freedom was nothing more than a technicality. They walked out of that concrete building completely stripped of their passports and relieved of every single marked dollar they had stolen from my safe. Their offshore accounts were entirely frozen by the massive environmental tax lien. They had no cash to their names. They had no escape route. They were utterly destitute. And I knew exactly where their primal desperation would drive them next. They assumed I was still lying unconscious on my living room sofa, heavily sedated by the toxic powder my own daughter had slipped into my coffee. They fully believed they could return to the scene of their crime, wake me up, and violently force me to wire whatever liquid funds remained in my domestic accounts. Their arrogance was so profound, they could not comprehend that the prey had constructed a cage for the predators. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving a thick, damp fog rolling across the suburban streets. I watched the high-definition security monitors as their rented sport utility vehicle came tearing around the corner. The vehicle lurched to a violent halt, parking half on the curb and half on the wet asphalt. Trevor threw the driver door open, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Amanda scrambled out of the passenger side, her designer clothes wrinkled and stained from a miserable night in federal holding. She marched up the driveway with her fists clenched, expecting to simply turn the brass handle and waltz right back into my life to demand her financial salvation. But my home was no longer the quiet, welcoming house where she grew up. While she was sitting in a windowless interrogation room, I had authorized a private security contractor to finalize the physical upgrades I had ordered weeks ago. Amanda stopped dead in her tracks at the end of the walkway. A heavy steel perimeter gate now blocked the front porch. She stared at the thick metal bars in absolute disbelief. She reached through the wrought iron attempting to grasp the front door handle, but the distance was deliberately calculated to keep her away. She rattled the heavy metal gate, screaming my name into the cold morning air. She demanded that I wake up. She demanded that I let her in. She shrieked that I owed her an immediate explanation for her frozen bank accounts. Her voice was shrill, echoing with the pathetic entitlement of a child who had never been told no. I watched her public meltdown from the glowing screens in my study while sipping a fresh cup of black coffee. The coffee tasted exceptionally good, without the heavy sedatives she usually preferred to serve me. I pressed a button on my desk, activating the exterior intercom system, but I kept my microphone completely muted. I wanted to hear every single desperate word they said. Trevor paced back and forth across the wet lawn, pulling at his hair like a madman. He yelled at Amanda, telling her that the underground gambling syndicate was going to find him before the end of the day. He told her those violent men were going to kill him if he did not pay them the $500,000 he owed. Amanda pounded her bare fists against the steel gate until her knuckles bled, sobbing and cursing my name. She yelled that I must have woken up early and locked the doors to punish her. She still could not grasp the catastrophic scale of her own failure. She still thought this was just a petty family dispute over a locked door. She told Trevor to find another way inside, claiming there was a digital safe in the basement they could pry open and empty. Trevor completely snapped. The sheer terror of his impending debts combined with the humiliation of his federal detention destroyed whatever fragile sanity he had left. He stomped back to the rented vehicle, threw open the rear hatch, and began tearing through the emergency roadside kit. He pulled out a heavy solid steel tire iron. He marched back toward the house, his eyes wide and vacant. Amanda cheered him on, pointing toward the rear of the property. She told him the patio doors leading to the kitchen were only standard glass and urged him to smash his way inside. I switched the main camera feed to the rear courtyard. I watched my son-in-law march across the wet grass, gripping the heavy steel bar like a club. He approached the large sliding glass doors of my patio. He did not know that the glass he was looking at was a ballistic-grade polycarbonate blend designed to withstand hurricane-force impacts. Trevor raised the tire iron high above his head, letting out a guttural scream of pure desperation. He swung the heavy metal bar with every ounce of his terrified strength directly at the center of the patio door. The impact was deafening, but the glass did not shatter. It merely fractured spider webbing into a dense pattern of white cracks. But the immense kinetic force of the blow triggered the secondary security protocol I had explicitly programmed for this exact scenario. The moment the structural integrity sensors registered a violent impact, an automated sequence engaged instantly. A loud mechanical grinding sound echoed from the roofline above the patio. Trevor stepped back, looking confused. Then the trap slammed shut. Heavy automated steel security shutters dropped from the concealed housing above the windows like a guillotine. They moved with terrifying speed, completely sealing the rear of the house in solid metal. Trevor panicked. In a desperate, irrational attempt to pry the dropping shutter away from the fractured glass, he shoved his left arm into the narrow closing gap. The sensors were not designed to reverse upon detecting an obstruction. They were designed for absolute lockdown. The heavy steel shutter slammed down onto Trevor's arm, pinning it brutally against the reinforced windowsill. A sickening crunch echoed through the exterior microphones, followed immediately by a blood-curdling scream. Trevor dropped to his knees, pinned to the side of the house, wailing in pure agony. Amanda ran around the corner to the patio, stopping in horror as she saw her husband trapped like a rat in a steel snare. She tried to pull his arm free, but the metal would not budge a single millimeter. She pounded on the steel shutter, begging for me to open the house. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching them writhe in the very trap they had begged to enter. I reached over to my control panel and finally unmuted the exterior intercom. My voice boomed through the hidden speakers surrounding the courtyard, cold and unyielding. I told them that trespassing on private property was a severe offense, but attempting a violent home invasion while out on federal bail was a catastrophic mistake. Amanda looked up at the security camera, her face pale with absolute terror. She realized I was not sedated. She realized I had been awake the entire time. Before she could scream another lie, a new sound pierced the damp morning air. It started as a faint wail in the distance, growing louder and more urgent by the second. The high-pitched shriek of multiple police sirens echoed down the suburban streets, approaching rapidly. The automated security system had not just dropped the shutters. It had silently dispatched a priority alert to the local precinct for an active armed robbery. I muted the intercom, leaned back in my chair, and waited for the authorities to arrive. The wail of the police sirens grew louder, echoing through the damp morning fog. The piercing sound triggered a primal survival instinct in the man bleeding on my patio. Trevor realized he was completely trapped between the dropping steel shutter and the impending arrival of law enforcement. Driven by sheer animal panic, he placed his heavy boots against the exterior brick wall and braced his body. He let out a guttural scream and violently yanked his trapped arm from beneath the heavy metal barrier. The sickening sound of tearing fabric and snapping bone resonated through the hidden microphones. Trevor tumbled backward into the wet grass, clutching his mangled limb against his chest. He was free from the shutter, but his arm hung at a grotesque angle. Amanda lunged forward, attempting to grab his uninjured shoulder. She begged him to stay with her, pleading for them to find another way inside the house together. But Trevor looked at his wife with cold, terrified eyes. The illusion of their partnership shattered in an instant. He shoved Amanda backward, causing her to stumble and fall against the fractured patio glass. He completely abandoned the woman he had sworn to protect, leaving her cornered on the patio while he stumbled toward the garden gate. He cared only about saving his own skin. But before Trevor could even reach the perimeter wall, the deep rumble of heavy engines cut through the wailing sirens. I watched my security monitors as two pitch-black sport utility vehicles came tearing around the corner. They did not slow down to check the address. They screeched to a violent halt right on my manicured front lawn, tearing deep, muddy gouges into the wet grass. They angled their heavy trucks to block the driveway, entirely shutting off any possible escape route to the street. The doors of the vehicles swung open simultaneously. 4 men stepped out into the freezing rain. They were dressed in dark, unassuming clothing, but the way they moved told a very clear story. These were not local street thugs or petty criminals. These were professional enforcers sent by the offshore gambling syndicate. They had crossed borders and tracked the digital footprint of the frozen escrow account straight to my doorstep. They had come to collect their $500,000, and they did not care that police cruisers were mere blocks away. Trevor froze in the middle of the garden. All the color drained from his face as he recognized the men stepping onto the lawn. The lead collector was a massive figure with a scarred neck. He reached inside his dark coat and pulled out a heavy firearm, racking the slide with a sharp metallic clack that my cameras picked up perfectly. Trevor stumbled backward, slipping on the wet grass. He tried to turn and run toward the rear retaining wall, desperately hoping to climb over the stone barrier and vanish into the dense woods behind my property. But he was injured, clumsy, and entirely out of his depth. 2 of the syndicate enforcers sprinted across the lawn with terrifying speed, easily cutting off his escape route. They grabbed him by the collar of his soaked designer suit and hurled him violently against the wet stone of the retaining wall. Trevor collapsed into the mud, gasping for air. Amanda watched the brutal scene unfold from the patio. The reality of her husband and his secret life finally crashed down upon her in full force. She realized the men who had just arrived were not here to negotiate a payment plan. They were here to extract a massive debt in blood. She turned back to the security camera mounted above the steel shutter. She pounded her bare fists against the cold metal, screaming my name. Her voice was raw and shattered. She begged me to open the door and save them. She shrieked that these men were going to murder Trevor right in my backyard. She was sobbing uncontrollably, completely trapped between the reinforced glass and the violent reality of the criminal underworld she had blindly married into. I sat in the leather chair of my study, my hands folded neatly on my desk. I watched the monitors with absolute detachment. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the woman screaming at my camera. She had brought the wolves to my doorstep. Now she was going to watch them feed. The men in the garden did not waste time asking questions. The lead enforcer stepped forward and drove a heavy combat boot directly into Trevor and his stomach. Trevor curled into a pathetic ball, coughing up blood and rainwater. He screamed that he had the money lying through his teeth to survive. He swore the funds were sitting securely in an offshore account and begged them for a laptop so he could wire the $500,000 immediately. The enforcer simply shook his head. He kicked Trevor again, this time squarely in the ribs. The sharp crack of bone was unmistakable. The syndicate knew Trevor was lying. Criminal enterprises of that magnitude have inside access to international banking networks. They already knew the money was locked tight by the federal government due to the environmental lien. They were not here to collect a check. They were here to deliver a very clear message about the fatal consequences of stealing from their operation. The police sirens were growing deafeningly loud now. They were less than a minute away. If I let this brutal beating continue, the syndicate would kill him on my lawn. I would be dragged into a messy homicide investigation that could expose my hidden assets and complicate my legal standing. I leaned forward and pressed the master override switch on my central security console. The entire exterior of my property erupted in blinding light. High-intensity tactical stadium lamps mounted along the roofline ignited simultaneously. They flooded the dark garden in a brilliant, harsh white glare. The sudden explosive illumination blinded the four armed men, forcing them to shield their eyes and step back from Trevor and his bleeding body. I engaged the outdoor public address system. My voice boomed across the courtyard, amplified and echoing like thunder through the heavy rain. I informed the men that local law enforcement would turn onto this exact street in exactly 60 seconds. I spoke clearly and calmly, telling them that Trevor and his accounts had been fully seized by the federal tax authorities. I stated that beating a dead man into the mud would not unlock frozen government assets, and it would only guarantee them life sentences in a federal penitentiary. The lead enforcer stared directly up at the blinding stadium lights, shielding his face from the glare. He was a professional who understood cold, hard logic. There was no money to be extracted from the bleeding man on the ground today. There was only the impending arrival of heavily armed police officers. He spat on Trevor and his motionless body holstering his weapon in one fluid motion. He gave a swift hand signal to his crew. The four men turned away from the wall and sprinted back to their idling sport utility vehicles. The heavy doors slammed shut and the massive engines roared in unison. The drivers threw the trucks into reverse, tearing out of my torn-up driveway and fishtailing wildly onto the wet asphalt. They sped away down the suburban street, vanishing into the thick fog just as quickly as they had arrived. Less than 10 seconds later, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers cut through the mist. The cruisers skidded to a halt in front of my property, illuminating the deep, muddy tracks left by the syndicate. Trevor was left broken, bleeding, and whimpering in the cold mud of my garden. Amanda slowly slid down the steel shutter, collapsing onto the wet patio stones, weeping in absolute despair. I turned off the stadium lights and picked up my phone to call my lawyer. The stage was perfectly set for the authorities to clean up the garbage left on my lawn. The precinct smelled of stale coffee and strong industrial floor cleaner. I sat in a hard plastic chair inside the dimly lit observation room, letting the cold reality of the concrete walls ground me. The space was completely silent, except for the low mechanical hum of the overhead ventilation system. Through the large rectangular mirror taking up the entire front wall, I looked directly into interrogation room number 4. The glass was essentially a portal to a harsh reality my daughter never thought she would have to face. Amanda sat at a scarred metal table, hunched over and shivering. Her expensive designer clothes were still damp and heavily splattered with the thick mud from my ruined garden. The dark makeup she had applied so carefully just hours ago was running down her pale cheeks in long, tragic lines. Detective Reynolds stood beside me in the observation room, holding a digital tablet and a thick manila folder. He was a seasoned veteran of the force, a man who had spent his entire career watching liars weave their intricate traps. He looked over at me and asked if I was prepared for what was about to happen. I nodded slowly, without a single trace of hesitation. I felt absolutely no anxiety, no sorrow, and no regret. I only felt the cold, calculated patience of an engineer watching the final phase of a controlled demolition. Detective Reynolds opened the heavy metal door and stepped into the interrogation room, leaving me in the shadows. The sound feed clicked on automatically, filling my small, dark space with the crisp audio of my daughter, preparing to lie to a federal officer. Amanda immediately launched into her performance the second the detective took his seat across the table. She let out a dramatic, ragged sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. She played the role of the traumatized, innocent victim with a terrifying level of perfection. She cried that she had just survived a brutal random attack in her own father's backyard. She begged the detective to dispatch officers to find the violent men in the black sport utility vehicles, claiming they were terrifying strangers who wanted to kill her husband for absolutely no reason at all. She described them as monsters who had targeted a successful tech executive out of pure jealousy. Detective Reynolds simply nodded, his face an unreadable mask, allowing her to spin her elaborate web of fabrications without interruption. Then she shifted her narrative directly toward me. She lowered her voice, putting on a mask of deep daughterly concern and feigned heartbreak. She told the detective that I was severely ill and totally incapable of managing my own affairs. She claimed my mental state had been deteriorating rapidly over the past few months, making me a danger to myself. She painted a tragic picture of a lonely man losing his grip on reality, suffering from advanced, untreated dementia. She swore with fresh tears streaming down her face that I had freely given her the coastal property out of a desperate desire to help her and Trevor start a new life overseas. She stated I simply forgot I had signed the legal papers because my brain was failing me. I sat in the dark room, listening to the child I had raised attempt to legally erase my sanity to cover up her own malicious crimes. It was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. She truly believed her performance was flawless and that her tears would buy her a ticket to freedom. Detective Reynolds let her talk for a full 10 minutes. He let her dig her own grave so deep there would be absolutely no way to climb out. When she finally ran out of breath and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, he did not ask a single clarifying question. He did not offer sympathy. He simply unlocked his digital tablet and placed it squarely in the middle of the cold metal table. He told Amanda he needed her to review some recent security footage to see if it jogged her memory about the events of the afternoon. He pressed play and stepped back, crossing his arms. The crisp, high-definition audio and video from my hidden living room cameras filled the small concrete room. The tablet displayed Amanda standing in my kitchen, pulling the small vial of heavy pharmaceutical sedatives from her coat pocket. The audio captured the exact scraping sound of her stirring the toxic white powder into my coffee. It captured her stepping callously over my supposedly unconscious body, without checking my pulse or showing an ounce of remorse. Then came the undeniable mechanical sounds of her using a heavy steel crowbar to violently pry open my wall safe. The recording caught her greedy, breathless whispers as she shoved the marked federal currency into her tote bag. I watched Amanda carefully through the two-way glass. The physical transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The fake tears completely stopped flowing. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost staring into the abyss. Her mouth hung open slightly, but no sound came out. The brilliant, tragic victim persona she had so carefully constructed shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the span of 30 seconds. She was staring at undeniable high-definition proof of her own malicious felony. Detective Reynolds did not give her a single moment to recover from the paralyzing shock. Before the video even finished playing its final frames, he opened the manila folder and slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was the forged deed transfer she had filed at the county clerk office. The document bearing the seal of Trevor's corrupt notary and my perfectly copied signature stared back at her. The detective tapped his finger heavily on the parcel identification number printed at the top of the page. He calmly explained to Amanda that she had not sold a beautiful, lucrative beach villa. He informed her that she had fraudulently assumed legal ownership of a condemned toxic waste site. He explained the massive federal environmental cleanup lien attached to that specific plot of dirt. He then detailed how she had inadvertently scammed a highly dangerous money laundering syndicate out of $500,000. He told her the federal government was already freezing every single asset tied to her name and her newly formed company. The sheer magnitude of her ruin finally crushed the breath out of her lungs. Amanda began to hyperventilate, gasping for air, as the reality of her situation closed in around her. The realization that she was facing decades in a federal penitentiary stripped away every last ounce of her marital loyalty. She looked at the forged deed and immediately pointed a trembling finger toward the wall. She screamed that it was not her idea. She yelled that Trevor had forced her to sign the documents against her will. She claimed Trevor was a manipulative monster who controlled her every move and masterminded the entire operation to pay off his massive underground gambling debts. She threw her husband to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, offering to testify against him if the police would just let her go. I watched her completely break down, shedding any remaining scrap of human decency to save herself. I turned my attention away from the glass and looked at the secondary monitor mounted on the wall of the observation room. It displayed the live video feed from interrogation room number 5, located right next door. Trevor was sitting at an identical metal table crying hysterically, with his broken arm secured in a temporary medical splint. Another detective was showing him the exact same mountain of evidence. I listened through the headset as Trevor sobbed uncontrollably, screaming that Amanda was a greedy psychopath who orchestrated the theft because she hated me and wanted my money. He was loudly confessing to every single detail of the crime solely to pin the ultimate blame entirely on his wife. He claimed she drugged me and she stole the cash while he was completely innocent. The two people who had conspired to steal my life and drive me insane were now sitting in adjacent concrete rooms, frantically trying to destroy each other to save their own skin. I sat in the quiet darkness, drinking my cold coffee, feeling an overwhelming sense of closure. The trap had worked perfectly. They were locking the prison doors from the inside. The courtroom smelled of polished mahogany and stale despair. I sat in the second row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution table. I wore a dark tailored suit projecting the image of a respectable citizen seeking quiet justice. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the room swung open, and the armed bailiffs escorted my daughter and her husband into the courtroom. They wore standard-issue orange detention jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound in heavy iron chains that clanked loudly against the marble floor with every step they took. Trevor walked with a noticeable limp, his arm secured in a rigid medical cast from his encounter with my steel security shutter. Amanda looked completely hollowed out. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes darted frantically around the room until they locked onto mine. She expected to see anger, or perhaps a glimmer of paternal pity. I gave her absolutely nothing. I looked right through her as if she were a piece of defective machinery scheduled for the scrapyard. Trevor had somehow managed to retain a high-priced criminal defense attorney using a line of credit from an old college associate. The lawyer was a slick, confident man who moved around the courtroom with theatrical arrogance. He approached the bench to argue the preliminary bail conditions for his clients. He immediately launched into a passionate, desperate narrative designed to paint me as the villain. He spun a wild, fabricated tale for the presiding judge, claiming that I was a vindictive, manipulative mastermind. He argued that I had deliberately orchestrated a malicious psychological trap to ruin my own family. He stated that I intentionally left a fake deed in my study and purposely provoked my daughter into taking it. He tried to convince the court that the entire situation was a complex setup designed to frame two innocent young entrepreneurs who were simply trying to secure a bridge loan for a struggling technology startup. He demanded that his clients be released on their own recognizance, claiming they were innocent victims of an elaborate scheme of entrapment. I sat perfectly still, listening to the ridiculous fairy tale. Beside me, my attorney, Stephen, gently unbuttoned his suit jacket and stood up. Stephen did not rely on theatrical performances or emotional manipulation. Stephen relied exclusively on chronological facts. He approached the podium carrying a thick, highly organized binder of time-stamped evidence. He addressed the judge with a calm, lethal precision that immediately commanded the attention of the entire room. He stated that the defense theory of a malicious trap was an absolute fabrication, and he had the digital forensics to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Stephen systematically dismantled the defense attorney and his ridiculous narrative. He began by placing the toxicology report and the high-definition video stills on the courtroom projector. He established the exact timeline of events to prove criminal premeditation. He pointed out that Amanda deliberately purchased heavy pharmaceutical sedatives 3 days before she ever visited my home. She forged my signature on the property transfer documents a full 24 hours before she arrived at my front door. Stephen played a brief audio clip of Amanda and Trevor coldly discussing how they were going to flee the country and leave me unconscious on the sofa. He emphasized the crucial chronological flaw in the defense strategy. Amanda and Trevor had committed premeditated forgery, attempted poisoning, and grand larceny entirely on their own volition long before the federal environmental tax lien ever froze their banking accounts. Stephen looked directly at the defense table, locking eyes with Trevor. He stated that I did not force Amanda to poison my coffee. I did not force Trevor to hire a corrupt notary. I did not force them to pry open my wall safe with a steel crowbar and steal $50,000 in marked federal currency. They executed these malicious felonies with eager enthusiasm because they were driven by their own insatiable greed. They were not trapped by a vindictive father. They were caught in the catastrophic consequences of their own criminal arrogance. Stephen concluded his argument by reminding the judge of the airport security footage. He reminded the court that the defendants were arrested at the international departure gate with their passports in hand and stolen cash in their luggage, attempting to flee from violent underground loan sharks. The judge leaned forward, peering over his glasses at the defense table. He did not look amused. The slick defense attorney tried to stammer out a rebuttal, but the judge raised his hand, demanding absolute silence. He looked at Amanda and Trevor with deep professional disgust. He stated that in his 20 years on the bench, he had rarely seen such a calculated and predatory betrayal of a family member. He systematically rejected every single argument the defense had presented. He declared that based on the undeniable video evidence, the flight risk was astronomical. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet room. He completely denied bail for both defendants, remanding them to county custody for the duration of the legal proceedings. Amanda let out a choked sob, collapsing forward onto the defense table. Trevor buried his face in his uninjured hand, trembling violently. They realized they were going straight back to their concrete cells, but the absolute destruction of their future was not over yet. As the bailiffs moved forward to escort the prisoners away, a new figure stood up from the front row of the gallery. It was a man in a crisp gray suit, carrying a briefcase bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The federal prosecutor approached the bench and requested permission to address the court regarding an ongoing parallel investigation. The room fell into a dead silence as the prosecutor opened his briefcase. He addressed the judge and the defense team, revealing a devastating piece of information that no one had anticipated. He explained that the rapid cash purchasing firm Amanda had sold the toxic coastal property to was not actually a money laundering front for an offshore cartel. The entire criminal syndicate was a highly classified ongoing federal sting operation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had set up the shell company months ago to track illicit property transfers and catch corrupt notaries, exactly like the one Trevor had hired. The prosecutor looked directly at Amanda. His voice was cold and completely devoid of any sympathy. He informed her that by willfully forging a legal property deed and executing a wire transfer with a known federal honeypot, she had blindly stumbled into a massive undercover operation. She did not just commit real estate fraud against her father. She actively engaged in interstate wire fraud, utilizing digital networks heavily monitored by the federal government. The prosecutor officially submitted a superseding indictment to the judge. He announced that Amanda and Trevor were no longer facing simple state-level grand larceny charges. They were now officially indicted under the Federal Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The sheer gravity of the federal racketeering charges sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. Amanda stopped crying and stared at the prosecutor in absolute catatonic shock. She was no longer a greedy daughter trying to steal a retirement fund. She was now a documented participant in a federal organized crime investigation, facing mandatory minimum sentencing that would span decades. The defense attorney slowly sat down, realizing his lucrative clients were permanently doomed, and his defense strategy was entirely useless. Trevor looked at Amanda, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization that they were going to spend the rest of their natural lives locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The bailiffs grabbed their heavy iron chains and forcefully pulled them toward the holding cell doors. I remained seated in the gallery watching them shuffle away into the darkness. I buttoned my suit jacket, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom. The air outside felt incredibly clean. The Federal Detention Center was a fortress of gray concrete and reinforced steel. I walked through the heavily guarded security checkpoints with absolute calm. The air inside smelled of bleach and institutional despair. A guard escorted me down a long, fluorescent-lit corridor into a small, windowless visitation room. A solid metal table divided the space. I sat in the hard plastic chair and folded my hands. I did not have to wait long. The heavy door on the opposite side of the room buzzed loudly and swung open. A female guard led my daughter inside. Amanda looked nothing like the arrogant woman who had called me just days ago to gloat about stealing my property. She wore a faded orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too large. Her hair was completely matted, and dark circles hung heavy under her bloodshot eyes. She shuffled toward the table and sat down heavily. The guard stepped outside and locked the door, leaving us entirely alone. Amanda immediately began to weep. It was a chaotic, desperate sound that echoed off the bare concrete walls. She reached across the cold metal table, attempting to grab my hands, but I smoothly pulled them back and rested them in my lap. Her tears flowed freely as she launched into a frantic, pathetic plea for salvation. She begged me to save her from spending the next 30 years in a federal prison. She claimed she was terrified and could not survive another night in her cell. She pleaded with me to pay the massive environmental protection agency lien attached to the toxic property. She firmly believed that if I simply wrote a check to the federal government, they would release the frozen escrow funds and make the racketeering charges disappear. She then begged me to drop the state-level burglary and attempted poisoning charges, claiming she was completely brainwashed by her husband. She swore she would spend the rest of her life making it up to me if I just gave her one more chance. I sat perfectly still, allowing her to exhaust her tears and her ridiculous demands. I did not interrupt her frantic monologue. I simply watched her attempt to deploy the same manipulative tactics she had used her entire life. She truly believed she could still play the role of the helpless victim. She thought her father would eventually crack under the weight of her sorrow and open his wallet to clean up her catastrophic mess. When she finally ran out of breath and sat gasping across the table, I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out a checkbook or a letter of forgiveness. I pulled out a single glossy photograph Rex had acquired during his meticulous forensic investigation. I placed the photograph face down on the metal table and slid it smoothly across the surface until it rested directly in front of her. I told her to look at it. Amanda wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her orange jumpsuit and slowly turned the picture over. I watched her eyes focus on the image. The photograph was taken 2 weeks before she executed the forged property sale. It showed the outdoor patio of an extremely exclusive seafood restaurant downtown. Trevor was sitting at a corner table laughing warmly. Sitting directly across from him was Leon, the corrupt public notary who had falsified my signature. But they were not alone. Sitting right next to Trevor, her hand resting intimately on his thigh, was a beautiful young woman Amanda had never seen before. I leaned forward and delivered the absolute truth with cold, surgical precision. I explained that Trevor never intended to take her to Europe. He never intended to build a new life with her using my stolen money. Rex had traced the secondary routing numbers embedded in the offshore gambling accounts. Trevor had indeed owed $500,000 to a violent syndicate, but he was planning to steal far more than that from my safe and the property sale. He had opened a separate hidden bank account in the Cayman Islands completely inaccessible to Amanda. He had also purchased 2 expedited international plane tickets to a country with no extradition treaty to the United States. One ticket was for him. The other ticket was for the woman in the photograph. I kept my voice low and steady, hammering every single fact into her mind. I told her that Trevor needed a disposable scapegoat to execute the actual forgery and handle the stolen cash. He manipulated her into physically drugging my coffee and breaking into my vault because he wanted her fingerprints on the crime scene. He convinced her to register the new limited liability company in her name alone so she would absorb any potential tax fallout from the rapid property sale. He knew the money laundering syndicate was dangerous, and he knew the real estate transaction was incredibly risky. Trevor was planning to let the offshore funds clear, then board a flight with his mistress, while Amanda stayed behind to deal with the inevitable federal investigations. He was going to abandon her to the wolves the moment the money hit his hidden account. The transformation unfolding across the metal table was spectacular. The frantic, pathetic sorrow completely vanished from my daughter's face. The desperate tears dried up instantly, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. Her eyes remained locked on the photograph of her husband, smiling with his mistress. I watched the realization wash over her. She had thrown away her entire inheritance, her freedom, and her father for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a convenient human shield. She had poisoned her own flesh and blood for a husband who was planning to leave her rotting in a federal prison. The profound sadness morphed rapidly into pure, venomous rage. Her hands stopped trembling and curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. I reached back into my suit pocket and withdrew a second document. It was a formal proffer agreement, drafted by the federal prosecutor and reviewed by Stephen. I laid the thick stack of legal papers next to the photograph. I told Amanda that Trevor was currently sitting in a cell 3 floors down, completely unaware that I possessed this photograph. I explained that the federal agents were highly interested in the intricate details of Trevor and his fraudulent technology startup. They suspected he had been running a massive wire fraud scheme for years, but they lacked the inside testimony required to build an airtight case. I told her she had a very simple choice to make. She could remain loyal to a man who engineered her destruction and serve 30 years in maximum security, or she could sign the proffer agreement and give the federal government every single piece of evidence they needed to bury Trevor permanently. Amanda did not hesitate for a single second. She grabbed the pen resting on the table. She did not ask about the specific terms of her reduced sentence or the conditions of her plea deal. Her desire for self-preservation was completely overshadowed by an absolute consuming need for vengeance. She signed her name on the dotted line with aggressive slashing strokes tearing through the top layer of the paper. She agreed to become the primary cooperating witness for the federal prosecution. She promised to surrender all the encrypted passwords, the hidden ledgers, and the falsified investor reports tied to Trevor and his fake corporate enterprise. She was going to personally ensure that her husband never saw the outside of a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. I picked up the signed proffer agreement and slid the photograph back into my pocket. I stood up from the hard plastic chair and adjusted my suit. Amanda looked up at me, her eyes burning with a dark, furious energy. She asked me if I was going to help her when the trial was over. She asked if she would have a home to return to once her reduced sentence was served. I looked down at the woman who had stirred poison into my morning coffee. I told her she had made a wise legal decision today, but she was no longer my daughter. I turned my back to her and knocked on the heavy metal door. The guard opened it immediately, allowing me to step out into the bright corridor. I left Amanda sitting alone in the interrogation room, completely consumed by the fire she had started. The chain was now perfectly set for the complete financial annihilation of everyone connected to Trevor. The morning air was crisp and painfully clear when the heavy knock sounded at my front door. I walked across the foyer and opened it to find a nervous young man holding a thick stack of legal documents. He asked if I was Vincent. I nodded. He thrust the papers into my hands, stated that I had been formally served, and walked quickly back to his vehicle. I stood on the porch feeling the cold breeze against my face as I looked down at the manila envelope. I did not feel fear. I felt a deep, familiar sense of exhaustion. Greedy people never know when a battle is truly over. They simply keep throwing themselves against the wall until they are entirely broken. I took the envelope into my study and spread the documents across my desk. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and began to read through the dense legal jargon. The lawsuit was filed by Gary and Patricia. They were the parents of the man who had just tried to steal my life savings and flee the country. According to the completely fabricated narrative presented in their civil claim, I was a malicious mastermind who had intentionally inflicted severe emotional and financial distress upon their family. They were demanding $10 million in compensatory damages. They claimed my actions had caused their son to suffer a psychological break, which led to his current incarceration. They argued that my hidden cameras and automated security shutters constituted a deliberate act of entrapment, resulting in Trevor suffering permanent physical injury to his arm. The absolute audacity of the document was almost impressive. Gary and Patricia were not wealthy people. They were middle-class retirees living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. They did not have the capital to retain the aggressive, high-priced legal team representing them. It was glaringly obvious what this lawsuit actually was. It was a desperate extortion attempt. Trevor was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. His defense attorneys required massive retainers to even begin negotiating a plea deal with the federal prosecutors. His parents were completely bankrupting themselves to save a son who had never cared about anyone but himself. They needed a massive injection of cash to keep his legal defense afloat, and they saw my estate as an open vault waiting to be looted. I finished my coffee, gathered the documents, and drove directly to the city. I sat in the soundproofed conference room, watching the rain streak against the floor-to-ceiling windows while Stephen read through the lawsuit. My attorney did not look concerned. In fact, a slow, cold smile began to spread across his face as he flipped to the final page of the civil claim. He placed the papers neatly on the glass table and folded his hands. He told me that Gary and Patricia had just made the final catastrophic mistake of their lives. By initiating a civil lawsuit against me, they had officially opened themselves up to a devastating counterstrike, and Stephen possessed the exact weapon required to completely eradicate their financial existence. Stephen opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound transcript. He explained that this document was the official transcript of Amanda providing her sworn federal testimony. When my daughter signed that proffer agreement in the detention center, she traded her absolute loyalty to her husband for a reduced prison sentence. She surrendered every single password, hidden ledger, and encrypted file connected to Trevor and his fake technology startup. She sang like a bird to the federal agents detailing every single fraudulent transaction Trevor had executed over the past 5 years. Stephen told me that the federal prosecutors had forwarded him a copy of her confession as a professional courtesy. He slid the transcript across the table and tapped a specific highlighted paragraph. He told me to read the details of Trevor and his initial startup capital. As I read the words, the true depth of my son-in-law and his predatory nature became horrifyingly clear. Trevor had not just stolen from his corporate firm. He had not just tried to steal from me. He had cannibalized his own parents to fund his early gambling addictions and his fake business ventures. According to Amanda and her sworn testimony, Trevor had secretly copied his parents' social security numbers and banking details years ago. While Gary and Patricia thought their son was building a successful software company, Trevor was actively committing massive identity theft against them. He had forged his father and his signature to take out multiple high-yield corporate credit lines. Worse than that, he had secretly leveraged their fully paid-off suburban home. Trevor had quietly taken out 2 massive secondary mortgages against his parents' property, funneling the cash directly into his offshore gambling accounts. He had set up a fake digital payment loop that paid just enough of the minimum monthly interest to keep the banks from noticing the massive outstanding debt. Stephen looked at me with absolute predatory focus. He explained that Gary and Patricia had absolutely no idea their home was currently leveraged for nearly $1 million in fraudulent debt. They believed they owned their property free and clear. They believed their son was a misunderstood genius targeted by a cruel father-in-law. Stephen laid out the strategy. We were not going to settle this frivolous lawsuit. We were not going to waste months in a courtroom arguing over emotional distress. We were going to cut the ground out from under them entirely. Stephen immediately drafted a motion for summary judgment to dismiss the ridiculous civil claim. But he did not stop there. He filed a massive countersuit against Gary and Patricia for frivolous litigation and malicious prosecution. Then Stephen executed the lethal blow. Utilizing his legal authority as an officer of the court, he submitted a formal notification to the 3 major financial institutions holding the fraudulent secondary mortgages on their suburban home. He provided the banks with a certified copy of Amanda and her federal confession, explicitly proving that the million-dollar loans were secured through deliberate identity theft and wire fraud. The reaction from the financial sector was absolutely merciless. Banks do not care about family loyalty or emotional distress. When major financial institutions realize a massive loan is tied to severe federal fraud and the primary debtor is currently sitting in a federal holding facility facing racketeering charges, they move with terrifying speed to secure their collateral. Within 48 hours of Stephen sending the notifications, the banks initiated immediate and aggressive foreclosure proceedings against Gary and Patricia. The illusion of their quiet suburban life shattered instantly. They received the foreclosure notices via certified mail, completely destroying their false reality. They discovered that their beloved son had secretly stolen their entire life savings and saddled them with $1 million in toxic debt. The equity they thought they had built over 30 years of hard work was completely gone, erased by the greed of the monster they had raised. Their high-priced civil attorney dropped them as clients the very next morning, realizing they possessed absolutely zero assets to pay his ongoing legal fees. The frivolous lawsuit against me was officially withdrawn with prejudice before the end of the week. They had tried to drain my resources to save their son, and instead they lost absolutely everything they owned. I did not feel a single shred of pity for them. They had bred a parasite, allowed his arrogance to grow unchecked, and then attempted to help him destroy my life to cover his crimes. Now they were completely bankrupt, facing immediate eviction and dealing with the unbearable realization that their son had ruined them without a second thought. The chain of absolute ruin was extending exactly as it was meant to, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind. The federal courthouse was a monument to absolute authority. It was built of solid granite and dark polished oak. The air inside the courtroom was heavy and perfectly sterile. It tasted of finality. I sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution table. I wore a charcoal suit tailored to project the quiet dignity of a man who had survived a nightmare and demanded absolute justice. Stephen sat beside me. He did not review any notes. There was nothing left to argue. The trial phase was completely over. Today was strictly reserved for the delivery of consequences. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the chamber opened with a loud mechanical clatter. 2 armed federal marshals escorted the prisoners into the room. Amanda and Trevor walked into the bright fluorescent light. They were bound in heavy iron chains that secured their wrists to their waists and their ankles to each other. The metallic drag of their shackles echoed through the dead silence of the courtroom. The physical and psychological decay they had suffered over the past months in federal lockup was absolutely spectacular to witness. Trevor dragged his feet. His arm had healed poorly from the crushing impact of my steel security shutter, leaving his shoulder permanently slumped at an awkward angle. He looked incredibly aged. His hair was thinning, and his face was drawn and pale. Amanda walked a few paces behind him. The arrogant, entitled woman who had laughed at me on the phone was completely gone. She looked hollow. Her skin was sallow, and her posture was completely broken. When they reached the defense table, they took their seats. They did not speak to each other. They did not even glance in each other's direction. The mutual hatred radiating between them was a physical presence in the room. Trevor blamed Amanda for signing the confession that doomed his fake technology enterprise and destroyed his parents. Amanda blamed Trevor for manipulating her into a federal racketeering conspiracy and planning to abandon her for his mistress. The marriage they had used to justify stealing my life savings was nothing more than a toxic pile of ash. The bailiff announced the arrival of the honorable federal judge. Everyone in the room stood up. The judge took his seat high above the floor, looking down at the defense table with an expression of profound, professional disgust. He arranged his thick files and looked out over the silent gallery before fixing his gaze entirely on my daughter and her husband. He began to speak. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely devoid of mercy. He stated that his courtroom had seen its fair share of violent criminals and predatory syndicates, but he noted that there is a unique type of evil reserved for individuals who actively seek to destroy the very people who gave them life and shelter. The judge addressed Trevor first. He instructed Trevor to stand. The chains clanked loudly as the broken femme rose to his feet, trembling visibly. The judge did not hold back. He systematically listed the catastrophic damage Trevor had caused, driven entirely by his degenerate gambling addiction and his insatiable narcissism. The judge spoke of the massive wire fraud, the money laundering, and the catastrophic identity theft Trevor had committed against his own elderly parents. He mentioned the sheer cowardice required to leverage a childhood home to pay off underground loan sharks. He stated that Trevor was a parasite who fed on the trust of his family and left nothing but absolute ruin in his wake. Trevor looked down at the floor, completely unable to meet the eyes of the man handing down his fate. The judge delivered the hammer. For the crimes of interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and severe financial elder abuse, the judge sentenced Trevor to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He explicitly denied any possibility of early parole, citing the lack of genuine remorse and the staggering financial devastation inflicted upon multiple innocent victims. Trevor collapsed back into his hard wooden chair, sobbing openly into his shackled hands. His life as a free man was permanently over. Then the judge turned his cold gaze toward Amanda. He ordered her to stand. She rose slowly, swaying slightly, as if the gravity of the room was physically crushing her. The judge looked at her with a profound sense of disappointment. He stated that while Trevor was the architect of the financial fraud, Amanda was the willing and eager executioner of a deeply personal betrayal. He reminded the court that Amanda had not just stolen money, she had attempted to permanently erase her father. The judge listed her crimes with brutal clarity. He spoke of the heavy pharmaceutical sedatives she had stirred into my morning coffee. He described the cold, calculated nature of a daughter willing to stop her father's heart just to break into his safe. He brought up the forged property deed and the catastrophic environmental liability she had blindly triggered. He told her that her greed had completely overridden her humanity. He stated that she was willing to sell my coastal property to a criminal money laundering enterprise without a single thought for the consequences. The judge made it clear that her signed confession and cooperation with the federal prosecutors were the only reasons she was not facing the exact same 20-year sentence as her husband. Amanda wept openly, her tears falling onto the polished wooden table. She whispered that she was sorry, but the judge raised his hand, demanding silence. He told her that her sorrow was entirely generated by her own capture, not by the pain she had inflicted. The judge delivered his final ruling. For the crimes of aggravated forgery, attempted poisoning, and federal environmental fraud, Amanda was sentenced to 12 years in a federal correctional institution. The judge banged his wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, finalizing the absolute destruction of their lives. The bailiffs moved forward immediately, grabbing Trevor and Amanda by the arms to escort them back to the holding cells. Trevor was dragged away, still weeping uncontrollably, completely shattered by the reality of his 2-decade sentence. Amanda moved much slower. As the armed guards turned her toward the side doors, she stopped. She turned her head and looked directly across the gallery, seeking me out in the crowd. Her eyes were red and swollen, pooling with a desperate, pathetic sorrow. She looked at me, waiting for a sign. She wanted a nod of pity. She wanted a brief look of parental forgiveness. She wanted any small indication that the father she had tried to destroy still loved her deep down. She wanted a shred of hope that when her 12 years were finally served, there would be a home waiting for her. I looked at the woman in the orange jumpsuit. I felt absolutely nothing. The paternal bond she had exploited and poisoned was completely dead. I did not offer her a smile. I did not offer her a tear. I simply raised my hands and slowly adjusted my silk tie, smoothing the fabric with meticulous care. I held her desperate gaze for one final second, demonstrating complete and utter indifference. Then I turned my back to her. I heard her let out a broken, agonizing wail as the guards forcefully pulled her through the heavy wooden doors. The heavy steel locks engaged with a loud, resounding click, sealing her away from the world. I buttoned my suit jacket, stepped out of the wooden pew, and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. Stephen walked beside me, matching my steady, even pace. We pushed open the grand double doors at the back of the chamber and stepped out into the expansive marble lobby of the courthouse. The severance was absolute. The cancer had been entirely excised from my life. I walked out of the building and stepped into the crisp afternoon air, breathing deeply for the first time in months. The gavel had fallen, and the heavy prison doors had locked, but the wreckage of a demolished building always leaves a thick cloud of dust in the air. The federal trial of my daughter and her husband was absolute catnip for the local news networks. Reporters swarmed around the courthouse and my property like vultures looking for scraps of flesh. They spun sensationalized narratives about a desperate young couple, a ruthless technology startup failure, and a highly complicated real estate scam. Some of the more fringe journalists even attempted to paint Amanda as a naive victim who accidentally purchased a toxic wasteland while trying to secure a simple bridge loan for her husband. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency, however, did not care about daytime television media narratives. They cared strictly about the $1.8 million cleanup lien attached to that condemned coastal parcel. With Amanda and her newly formed company effectively seized, bankrupted, and dismantled by the federal government, the toxic dirt was currently sitting in a state of legal purgatory. The environmental agency was circling the wreckage, preparing to trace the chain of custody directly back to me. At the same time, Trevor and his surviving criminal associates, along with his completely ruined parents, were desperately searching for a vulnerability. They were looking for any possible angle to launch a civil suit and drain my resources to cover their catastrophic losses. They needed a villain to blame for their spectacular downfall. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a prolonged battle in the court of public opinion. I was going to bury them under a monument of my own design. I sat in my quiet study watching the morning rain wash over the reinforced glass of my patio doors. The new heavy steel shutters were currently hidden away in their housing, a silent metal testament to the night Trevor shattered his arm and his future. Stephen, my attorney, sat across from me holding a thick file from the environmental agency. He warned me that if the toxic property reverted to my personal portfolio, I would be forced into a grueling bureaucratic war with the federal government. The media would undoubtedly twist the narrative, portraying me as an uncaring millionaire hoarding a contaminated coastline while my own daughter rotted in a prison cell. I poured Stephen a cup of black coffee and told him I had absolutely no intention of fighting the government or hiding from the press. We were going to control the narrative with a single unassailable maneuver. We were going to build a fortress of civic duty right on top of their greed. I instructed Stephen to draft a highly specific charitable grant and to contact the office of the state governor immediately. I was going to donate the poisoned land directly to the State Park Conservation Authority. The plan was a masterpiece of financial and public relations engineering. I established a private philanthropic trust, heavily front-loaded with the capital I had previously earmarked for Amanda and her inheritance. Instead of paying the environmental lien as a punitive penalty, I voluntarily funded the entire $1.8 million cleanup operation through a direct charitable grant. Stephen ensured the legal paperwork was absolutely bulletproof. By structuring the massive payment as a philanthropic donation to the State Conservation Authority, I effectively wiped out the federal lien while simultaneously writing the entire expenditure off against my corporate taxes. The contaminated parcel would be scrubbed clean by state-approved contractors. The toxic soil would be safely removed and replaced with native coastal flora. The land would be completely transformed into a protected public nature reserve. I was turning the exact weapon Amanda used to destroy herself into a permanent tax-deductible shelter that benefited the entire region. To seal the vault permanently, I needed to address the circling vultures directly. I rented the main conference hall at a downtown hotel the exact kind of luxury venue Trevor used to frequent when pretending to be a successful tech executive. Stephen stood by my side as I walked up to the wooden podium. The bright flashes of dozens of cameras illuminated the room blindingly fast. Reporters shouted overlapping questions about my daughter, the money laundering syndicate, and the federal racketeering charges. I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence, and the room fell completely quiet. I did not speak with sorrow, and I did not speak with anger. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of a man who had survived a devastating betrayal and chosen to rise completely above it. I looked directly into the camera lenses and stated that my family had suffered a profound tragedy driven by unchecked greed and criminal deception. I acknowledged that my daughter had made catastrophic choices that resulted in her rightful federal incarceration. I did not defend her, nor did I express any false pity. Instead, I shifted the focus entirely to the coastal property that had served as the catalyst for their ultimate downfall. I announced that the toxic parcel of land, which had been the subject of so much illicit criminal scheming, would no longer be a source of poison for our community. I formally presented the deed transfer, signing the land over to the State Parks Department, right there on the podium under the glare of the news cameras. I announced my fully funded charitable grant guaranteeing the press and the public that the extensive environmental cleanup would not cost the local taxpayers a single cent. The atmosphere in this press room shifted instantaneously. The journalists who had arrived hoping for a messy, emotional family drama were completely disarmed by the cold, hard philanthropy. They were witnessing a betrayed father taking the ultimate high road, transforming a filthy criminal scandal into a monumental act of public charity. I explained that the new nature reserve would be dedicated to the preservation of the coastline, serving as a place for honest families to gather safely and enjoy the natural beauty of our state. I answered absolutely no questions regarding Trevor, the offshore accounts, or the violent syndicate. I simply thanked the federal authorities for their diligent work, stepped away from the podium, and let Stephen distribute the detailed press release folders. The media had their story, and it was exactly the narrative I wanted them to broadcast. By the time the evening news programs aired, the story was permanently cemented in the public consciousness. I was no longer the tragic father of a convicted felon or the target of a bizarre real estate scam. I was the stoic, generous philanthropist who had suffered a terrible family betrayal, but chose to enrich the community instead of hoarding his wealth in bitterness. The state governor publicly thanked me on television, praising my commitment to environmental restoration. Various ecological groups lauded my massive financial donation. The public sympathy shifted entirely in my favor, creating an impenetrable shield of goodwill around my name and my estate. This highly public maneuver achieved its primary objective with flawless tactical precision. Trevor and his ruined parents, who were still desperately looking for a way to sue me for their foreclosure and financial devastation, found themselves facing an absolute brick wall. No civil attorney in the state would dare touch a frivolous lawsuit against a celebrated local hero who had just donated millions to public conservation. The optics would be career suicide for any law firm. Furthermore, the underground loan sharks, realizing my assets, were now highly publicized and actively monitored by federal agencies, celebrating the land donation, completely backed off. I had made myself too visible, too respected, and far too legally insulated to be a profitable target for extortion. The residual mess of the toxic property was completely swept away, leaving behind a pristine legacy that Amanda could never touch or corrupt. I drove back to my quiet suburban house that evening, listening to the praise echoing through the radio stations. I pulled into the driveway and looked at the heavy steel gate protecting my front porch. The house was finally safe. My finances were entirely secure. The toxic dirt that had ruined my daughter was now a protected state park, and I had received a massive tax break for the privilege of giving it away. The cleanup was officially complete, and the silence in my home felt absolutely perfect. The storm had finally broken over the city, leaving a cold, clear sky in its wake. The air tasted sharp and metallic as I drove my truck back toward the industrial park on the edge of the city limits. The federal trial was over, the prison doors were locked, and the toxic property had been donated to the state, but there was still one loose thread hanging in the wind. A structural engineer never leaves a project until every single stress point is resolved and every foundation is secured. I pulled up to the hollowed-out warehouse where Rex operated his digital forensics network. The heavy metal door rolled up before I even put the truck in park. Rex was already waiting for me, sitting behind his sprawling bank of glowing monitors. He did not offer a congratulatory handshake or a warm smile. He simply pointed to an empty folding chair beside his desk and handed me a steaming cup of terrible black coffee. We had a ghost to hunt. Before the federal authorities had seized Amanda and Trevor at the departure gate, Trevor had been exceptionally busy moving assets. We knew he had stolen $50,000 in marked bills from my safe, but that was simply cash for their immediate escape. The real prize was the digital wealth he had been quietly siphoning and laundering through his fake technology startup over the last 5 years. He had cannibalized his own parents' home and diverted unauthorized lines of credit into a hidden financial maze. He intended to use that seed money to fund his new life overseas with his mistress once he abandoned my daughter. The federal prosecutors had frozen his known domestic accounts, but a man as deeply embedded in illegal gambling and corporate embezzlement as Trevor always keeps a secret vault hidden in the dark. Rex began typing with the relentless mechanical rhythm. He was running a proprietary decryption program, tapping into the global banking networks that operate far beyond the jurisdiction of standard tax authorities. He was looking for anomalies, for tiny fractions of digital currency moving through anonymous servers just before the federal sting operation shut Trevor down. For 3 hours, the only sound in the cold warehouse was the aggressive clatter of the keyboard and the low hum of the cooling fans. Rex bypassed standard firewalls and dug deep into the routing numbers associated with the corrupt notary who had facilitated the forged property deed. Thieves like Trevor always leave a digital fingerprint because their arrogance convinces them they are smarter than the systems they exploit. Suddenly, a string of green text populated across Rex's central monitor. A slow, predatory smile appeared on his face. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He had found the ghost. Trevor had established a highly encrypted offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands under a completely fictitious corporate entity. He had used a fabricated passport and a stolen corporate identity to build this financial safety net. Rex pulled up the current balance of the hidden account. Sitting completely untouched in a silent digital vault was nearly $800,000. It was the culmination of his parents' ruined equity, the embezzled funds from his failed company, and the early fruits of his gambling ventures. It was the war chest he planned to use to build his new empire, while my daughter took the fall for his crimes. I stared at the staggering number on the screen. Trevor was currently sitting in a maximum security penitentiary, believing this money was waiting for him. He likely assumed that once he served his 20-year sentence, he could quietly access this offshore vault and live out his remaining days in quiet luxury. He believed he had successfully hidden a piece of his criminal enterprise from the federal prosecutors. I pulled out my phone and called Stephen. I told my attorney that Rex had just located the offshore account and forwarded the exact routing coordinates and the fictitious corporate name directly to his secure server. Stephen moved with terrifying legal efficiency. The mechanism for reclaiming this stolen wealth had already been perfectly established during the federal trial. When Amanda signed her comprehensive proffer agreement in the detention center, she had sworn under penalty of perjury to surrender every single piece of knowledge she possessed regarding her husband and his illicit financial networks. She had provided the exact dates, times, and amounts of his early money laundering efforts. Stephen took this certified federal transcript and the new digital coordinates provided by Rex directly to a federal judge. The legal execution was flawless and absolute. Stephen secured a rapid federal seizure warrant citing the undeniable proof that the offshore funds were the direct proceeds of interstate wire fraud and identity theft. Normally, foreign banking institutions resist American legal warrants to protect their wealthy clientele. However, no offshore bank wants to risk their international operating licenses by harboring funds actively tied to a highly publicized federal racketeering conviction. The moment Stephen presented the official United States Department of Justice warrant, the foreign financial institution capitulated entirely. They instantly dissolved the fictitious corporate entity, froze the illicit funds, and complied with the asset recovery order. 48 hours later, my personal banking portal chimed with a priority notification. The federal government had routed the reclaimed funds directly into my primary checking account. I sat in my quiet study looking at the massive deposit. $800,000 had just been legally ripped away from the man who tried to destroy my life. Trevor had nothing left. His freedom, his marriage, and his secret financial lifeline were completely eradicated. The victory was absolute, but as I stared at the numbers on my monitor, I felt a profound sense of disgust. This was not clean money. This wealth was generated from the absolute ruin of innocent people. It was built on the shattered retirement of Trevor's parents, the stolen capital from his investors, and the deep, malicious betrayal of my own daughter. I realized I could not keep this money. Mixing these poisoned funds with my hard-earned savings felt like a violation of the quiet, honest life I had built over the last 40 years. I did not need this windfall to survive. My estate was fully secured, my properties were protected, and my pension was intact. But I knew exactly what this money could do. It could become a shield for those who could not defend themselves. I called Stephen and requested one final monumental legal maneuver. I instructed him to draft the charter for a completely new, irrevocable entity. I took every single cent of the reclaimed offshore funds and established a private philanthropic trust. The charter was written with incredibly specific, rigid parameters. This trust was not designed for general charity or public works. It was exclusively engineered to provide ruthless, high-end legal representation, private investigation services, and forensic accounting for elderly individuals who were being financially abused, manipulated, or targeted by predatory family members. I knew there were thousands of people out there just like me, people who had worked their entire lives only to become targets of the greedy, entitled children they had raised. People who did not possess the hidden wealth, the technical knowledge, or the ruthless contacts like Rex and Stephen to fight back against the sudden betrayal of their own blood. This trust fund would become their sword and their shield. It would pay for the aggressive litigation required to freeze stolen assets, evict parasitic relatives, and restore the dignity of the vulnerable. Stephen finalized the paperwork and brought it to my house for the official signing. He asked me what I wanted to name the new legal entity. I did not hesitate. I named it the Catherine Memorial Trust. Catherine was my late wife, the woman who had helped me build this home and who had loved our daughter with an absolute pure devotion. She had passed away before the greed had corrupted Amanda completely. By naming the trust after her, I was taking the toxic, dirty money generated by our daughter and her husband and transforming it into a permanent fortress of protection that honored the best parts of our family. I signed the documents with a steady hand, sealing the legacy forever. I had taken the ashes of a catastrophic betrayal and forged them into a weapon for justice. The hidden vault was completely empty, and the silent reckoning was moving toward its final, quiet conclusion. I handed the paperwork back to Stephen, walked out to my front porch, and watched the afternoon sun break through the remaining clouds. The air was perfectly still. I drove my truck south along the winding coastal highway, leaving the concrete sprawl of the city completely behind me. The heavy storm systems that had battered Seattle for weeks had finally broken apart. A pale winter sun was fighting its way through the fractured clouds, casting long golden rays across the gray water of the Pacific Ocean. I drove with the windows rolled down, letting the freezing salt air fill the cabin of the truck. The sharp wind scrubbed the lingering scent of the courthouse from my clothes. I had spent the last several months navigating a maze of federal prosecutors, criminal defense attorneys, and hostile family members. I had dismantled my own daughter and her husband, sending them to federal prison, and stripping them of every stolen asset they possessed. I had turned their greed into a public conservation project, and their illicit offshore funds into an ironclad legal defense trust. The structural integrity of my life was completely secure. There were no more traps to set. There were no more surveillance feeds to monitor. The silent reckoning was over. Now it was time to finally go home. I turned off the main coastal highway onto a private, unmarked gravel road. The narrow path wound through a dense thicket of towering evergreen trees, completely obscuring any view from the public street. I navigated the familiar sharp curves until I reached a heavy slatted timber gate secured into the rock wall. I pressed a button on my visor, and the gate slid open silently on a concealed track. I pulled the truck forward, and the trees abruptly parted, revealing the actual coastal property my daughter had attempted to steal. The real beach villa was an architectural masterpiece of my own personal design. It was a sprawling modernist structure built of dark steel, poured concrete, and rich natural cedar. It sat cantilevered over a massive granite cliff, perfectly integrated into the rugged coastal landscape. Floor-to-ceiling ballistic glass wrapped around the entire western facade, offering an uninterrupted panoramic view of the crashing ocean below. Amanda had never seen this house. She had only ever seen a misfiled property folder bearing the coordinates of a toxic industrial wasteland. She had been so consumed by her desperate need to cash out my life savings that she never bothered to verify what she was actually selling. Her profound arrogance had protected my true sanctuary. This house remained completely untainted by her greed. I parked the truck and walked up to the heavy steel front door. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The air in the foyer was immaculate, carrying the faint, clean scent of cedar wood and the distant, salty mist of the ocean. There was no mud tracked across the floors by violent syndicate enforcers. There were no smashed glass panels or dropping steel security shutters. I did not need to check the corners of the ceiling for hidden surveillance cameras. I did not need to run an audio sweep to see if anyone was plotting to poison me in my sleep. The absolute security of the space washed over me. I walked through the pristine, open-concept living area, letting my fingertips run across the smooth, polished concrete surfaces. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I moved into the minimalist kitchen and walked over to the stainless steel espresso machine. I went through the quiet mechanical motions of grinding the dark roasted beans and tamping the grounds. I locked the portafilter into place and watched the rich, dark liquid extract into a heavy ceramic mug. I did not need to inspect the rim of the cup for a faint, chalky residue. I did not need to calculate the precise moment to fake my own collapse. I simply picked up the mug and took a long, slow sip. The coffee was strong and bitter and perfectly clean. It was the taste of absolute autonomy. I carried the mug across the living room and slid open the massive glass door leading to the rear of the property. I stepped out onto the expansive wooden deck that hovered directly over the sheer drop of the cliff. The cold ocean breeze immediately hit my face, biting and pure. Below me, massive gray waves violently crashed against the jagged granite rocks, sending spectacular plumes of white sea spray high into the air. The vast, untamed power of the ocean stretched out to the horizon, making the petty, treacherous ambitions of my daughter and her husband feel incredibly small and entirely insignificant. They had destroyed their own lives, chasing a fleeting illusion of wealth and status. I stood on the edge of the world, holding the very thing they had failed to steal. My cell phone began to vibrate in the inner pocket of my coat. The sudden mechanical buzzing broke the steady rhythmic roar of the ocean waves. I reached into my jacket and looked at the bright digital screen. The caller identification displayed the name of my attorney. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear, greeting Stephen with a calm, steady voice. Stephen did not waste time with casual pleasantries. He knew I appreciated pure, unfiltered data. He told me he was calling directly from the federal appellate courthouse. He stated that the high-priced defense lawyers Trevor and Amanda had managed to secure on a pro bono basis had formally submitted their final desperate appeal. They had attempted to argue that the federal sentencing guidelines were applied improperly, and that the electronic wire fraud evidence was circumstantial. I stood on the wooden deck, watching a pair of seagulls circle the violent water below. I waited in perfect silence for Stephen to deliver the final verdict. He took a brief breath and informed me that the three-judge appellate panel had deliberated for less than 20 minutes. They had reviewed the comprehensive federal confession Amanda had signed along with the high-definition surveillance footage of the attempted poisoning and the bank fraud. They had formally denied the appeal with absolute prejudice. Stephen explained exactly what that legal term meant. It meant the court found their arguments so fundamentally flawed and legally baseless that they were permanently barred from ever bringing the case before an appellate judge again. They had exhausted their final legal maneuver. There would be no more hearings. There would be no more desperate motions filed in the dark. There would be no early release programs or sentence reductions. Trevor would serve every single day of his 20-year federal sentence. Amanda would serve every single second of her 12-year sentence. The heavy iron doors of their respective penitentiaries were now permanently sealed until their debt to society was paid in full. I took another slow sip of my coffee. I thanked Stephen for his exceptional work over the past year. I told him I would review the final billing statements on Monday, but that he should take the rest of the week off and enjoy the victory. He agreed, wishing me a quiet and peaceful weekend. We ended the call with a mutual, unspoken understanding that our professional war was definitively won. I lowered the phone and looked at the black screen for a long moment. This small digital device had delivered the initial arrogant phone call from Amanda, announcing her triumphant escape and the sale of my property. It had been the conduit for their lies, their frantic extortion attempts, and their ultimate panicked downfall. I pressed my thumb against the side button, holding it down until the power menu appeared on the glass. I swiped the screen and watched the digital display fade into complete blackness. I powered the device down entirely, severing my final connection to the chaotic, noisy world they had forced me to navigate. I slipped the dead phone into my pocket and grasped the thick wooden railing of the deck. I closed my eyes and listened to the rhythmic, endless crashing of the tide against the ancient rocks. The air was freezing, but I did not shiver. I stood alone on the edge of the cliff, completely unburdened by the weight of a toxic family. The surgical excision of the rot was a complete success. The silent reckoning was finished. I opened my eyes and looked out at the infinite horizon. I was finally truly free. The most profound truth I have uncovered is that true wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account or the properties on a deed, but by the peace of mind that comes from living an authentic life. For years, I operated under the false assumption that sacrifice and silence were the hallmarks of a good parent. I learned the hard way that protecting those who are determined to destroy you is not an act of love, but an act of self-betrayal. Dignity is not a luxury, it is a necessity that must be guarded at all costs. If you have ever felt like an ATM instead of a person in your own family, let me know your story in the comments below.